Righty-ho, so this is the other animals part 2. We left the animals off at that euphoric moment when they worked together, they combined their forces. Those two phrases that told us that. We had the idea that they were working with one accord. Remember, that's a motif that is repeated and repeated throughout the narrative of animalism. And starts off with that idea that when they worked together they achieved their objectives. Remember, they had that moment where they galloped in a body, round and round the farm, around the boundary of the farm, because they couldn't quite believe what they'd done. So with one accord and in a body showed the animals working together, and they created what they desired most of all. They got rid of man, the only creature who consumes without producing, and they got rid of man. So let's see where they go from here. Okay, now in chapter 1 we had that idea of Old Major and his sharing of his dream, but also to underscore that dream, Orwell showed us the reality that Molly was vain and Boxer was stupid and the cat was asleep and Benjamin was apathetic. Well, what we have here is the idea that the animals think they've achieved their dream, that they have finally got what they could never imagine ever achieving at the start of chapter 1. But reality kicks in, and reality is a little message of disappointment, I suppose. Look at this in relation to Molly, with the vanity of Molly. Different perspectives on the same idea. Okay, the ribbons. What do the ribbons represent to Molly? They are representative of her vanity, of herself as an individual, of her ideas and dreams of who she is and what people value her for. They value her because she's beautiful, and she enjoys preening herself, and she enjoys her ribbons. However, look what Snowball says. Snowball says ribbons should be considered as clothes and all animals should go naked. So therefore, ribbons to Snowball are the enemy, and ribbons to Molly are desired and desperate items that she loves. Now, the idea of having different perspectives on the same things, that will become increasingly ominous as the novel progresses. Remember how the animals believe the Battle of the Cowshed developed, and how Squealer actually makes them remember the Battle of the Cowshed developing later on. So different perspectives could be seen as a theme that goes through this book. Okay, now in relation to the ribbons, obviously those are items of humanity that Snowball wants the rest of the animals to discard, and Boxer, as a faithful and devoted follower, he makes his sacrifices. He has his little small straw hat. Now, his straw hat is a little bit different to Molly's ribbons. It's functional. It does something to protect him. It protects him from the flies in the summer, and yet he makes that personal sacrifice. He flung it on the fire because he's showing his devotion. He's showing that he believes the sacrifices are necessary, and he's willing to make that sacrifice. But the sacrifices are always made by the individuals, by Snowball, by Molly, though Molly sacrifices reluctantly made, and she does go back on it because she's found with ribbons later on. And what we have to remember is Boxer, he puts himself in a position of discomfort to remain true to an ideology that he doesn't understand. Now, is that admirable or is that stupid? It's really up to you to decide, and I think the answer that it's a bit of both, and that's why we can't just have simplistic, oh, Boxer's a hero, boo, Napoleon's the enemy answers, because that doesn't show depth of characterisation. What I'd like you to pick up on is that either way, he stands in opposition to the pigs who, instead of working for a system, make a system work for them. Now, that's a really good phrase that you can use whenever you're talking about any of the animals. They work for a system, but the pigs make the system work for them. Different styles of leadership. Now remember, you've got the 3 types of power that the pigs represent. You've got the physical power of Napoleon, the intellectual power of Snowball, and the rhetorical power of Squealer. And if you have a little look at what happens when the animals drive Mr. Jones off the farm, then the pig's leadership begins. But there's a complete contrast in the style of leadership. So look at the first actions. Snowball's first action is to throw the ribbons on the fire and declare that all animals should go naked. So his first action is to reinforce doctrine. He focuses on ideology and not on individuals. Now, that is because he is focused on doctrine. He is focused on the rules of animalism and the idea of animalism. And that will serve him, I suppose, a disservice as the novel goes on, because it shows that he is out of touch. Why did the rebellion happen in the first place? Because the animals were hungry. Because Mr. Jones was too drunk to feed them. And therefore, what do the animals need more than anything else? Do they need another ideology, another way to believe in a system that they don't understand? No, they need food. And that's what Napoleon realises. His first action is to serve out double rations, because he knows, first of all, feed the animal's stomach, and then you can feed their brains. And that way, all of the other animals are going to look to Napoleon as the person who can provide them with their basic needs. It's a means of ingratiating Napoleon, or for Napoleon to make the other animals dependent and reliant upon him for the most important thing, food, sustenance. Is it more important to have a full belly or a full brain? Well, for Napoleon, he realises that the rest of the animals really want a full belly. Now, when we remember, when we looked at the stylistic devices PowerPoint, Orwell's novel is written in this detached tone, the matter-of-fact tone of a journalist. And remember, that's what Orwell was. He was a journalist. So you have the detached tone of the narrative voice. And when you have that tone, it creates this sense of distance. However, Orwell will, at significant moments, he will bring in a more descriptive style of writing. So he'll bring in language that is more emotive. Now, look at some examples here. He makes us feel sympathetic for the animals by allowing us to feel the depth of their pleasure and elation when they have achieved this wonderful objective. He brings in these descriptive phrases. In the ecstasy of that thought, sweet summer grass, mouthfuls of sweet summer grass, lick up clods of black earth and snuffed its rich scent. There's a real sense of how emotional the relationship between the animals and their land is. You know, it feeds them emotionally, it feeds them physically. They have a connection with this farm, a real connection with this farm, that Orwell uses descriptive language to allow us to understand. Now, because the descriptive language is there, it reinforces the momentous impact of this for the animals, the glorious thing, that lovely little emotive phrase, the glorious thing that they have achieved. And when we can enjoy this moment with the animals, we are, I suppose, to remember it later on in the novel, because it will only, by remembering the emotive connection here, we can only feel increasingly disappointed when the animals themselves are betrayed. Because if we remember the sweet summer grass, if we remember how they snuffed up the rich scent of this earth, then we will be so emotionally charged when we find out how they've been betrayed. You know, when they're standing there and they can look at, the phrase is, pile of corpses around Napoleon's feet, we should remember this descriptive moment of the sweet summer grass and realise how these animals have had their hopes and their dreams betrayed. Now, this goes back to the slide that we had, what happens when dreams are confronted by reality. And Orwell again uses this technique, foreshadowing, to suggest what is to come. We talked about Molly and her desire for the ribbons, but we also talked about the sacrifice that was made, that the ribbons were flung on the fire with Snowball. However, Molly goes back to her ribbon. she has taken a piece of blue ribbon and she's admiring herself. And it shows that individual desires, self-interest, there it is there. There's it there. Self-interest will take over. The self-interest of the pigs takes over, so they shouldn't really be surprised, nor should we, when the self-interest of Molly takes over. The fact that the pigs teach themselves to read and write, it foreshadows how the pigs are separating themselves and making themselves different from the rest of the animals. The reading and writing of Snowball, one of his grand schemes and committees, it's called a success later on, and yet for the other animals, we find out that many of them don't get beyond the letter A. So education is creating that idea of inequality, and that's something that the pigs are happy enough to foster, because they want to be able to be separate and different, because separate and different can mean better. And of course that brings in the idea of hierarchy, which undermines everything that Old Major dreamed about in chapter 1. But remember, Old Major is the man on the raised platform. Well, he's not, he's a pig, but Old Major is the pig on the raised platform. So you could say that the inequality that Old Major dreamed of is but that, a dream. In reality, there will always be separate, there will always be different ideas and beliefs. Okay, that idea too, that the pigs, when they take over, perhaps overlook, maybe deliberately, the needs of the other animals. And you can see it here with the cows who had been uneasy for some time. The cows haven't been milked. And again, the pigs are too busy focused on politics and their commandments to recognise the needs of the cow. The cow needs to be milked. The cows need to be milked. And perhaps that foreshadows that ideology and the message will always be placed before the animal's needs. And of course that's true for Snowball, and definitely true for Napoleon, though his ideology, his message is limited to Napoleon is always right. It's always about his ego. Okay, now at the end of chapter 2, where you have those emotive phrases, glorious thing, where you have the idea of the animals galloping in a body, where you have the idea of the animals working with one accord, you have that wonderful idea of unity peppered through chapter 2. But at the end of chapter 2, what do you have? You have the issue of the disappearing milk. Why is it important? Well, the animals have a legitimate concern. They say, what's going to happen to all that milk? And Napoleon dismisses it completely. In fact, he goes beyond just dismissing it. What does he do? If you have a little look, he places himself in front of the bucket. And this is a metaphor, because he places himself in front of the milk, just how he will always place his needs. And in fact, they're not needs. What are they? They are just desires. He places those in front of the other animals. So this lovely little metaphor represents how the dream is really starting to die at the end of chapter 2, even though it's only achieved in chapter 2. Such simple ideas as placing himself in front of the milk let us know that leaders will be easily able to manipulate the followers. Okay, now you've got some positive language at the start of chapter 3. You've got that idea that the animals have achieved what they dreamed of. They are as happy as they ever conceived it possible to be. Utopia, that heaven-like place, seems to be within their grasp. But the key thing is they don't make links. They don't make links to what Napoleon has just done when he's placed himself in front of the milk. They don't make a link to that and then to the reality of the life that they lead. So they don't go, I wonder, does that mean anything? They just accept everything on face value. And that way, their hopes and their dreams will be easily changed and manipulated by the pigs. Utopia is apparently in their grasp as long as they do not scrutinise the reality of what they're being offered, as long as they don't think about it, as long as they don't think, oh, well, where did the milk go? Okay, this links back to the verb choice that we've talked about before, of how easily the other animals absorb everything. And in the narrative voice, you have this idea that the other animals are impressed by the fact that they are not working for those worthless parasitical human beings. Now, you know how simplistic the other animals are, so this language, which is emotive and harsh and which is quite damning, is obviously the assimilation of the language of the pigs, which the other animals easily absorb. They're like sponges. They absorb everything that they're told. Righty-ho. Now, do you remember we said that it seems as if their dreams are within their grasp, that utopian state that they desire is almost within reach? Well, what we have here, as long as they don't think about it too much, as long as they don't scrutinise it too much, well, what we here have is the opportunity of qualifying statements. Oh, don't know why it did that. Qualifying statements being used, i.e., have a little look at this. The narrative voice says what the animals want to believe, that nobody shirked, that they're working together in that unit. Remember the to be phrases with one accord, which is a motif repeated throughout, and galloped in a body. So you have this idea that nobody shirked, that everyone is playing their part. But then you have this additional phrase, this qualifying statement, or almost nobody. So you can believe that you've achieved your goal of equality and your goal of collectivism if you just believe the first part of the sentence, nobody shirked. But the additional part, that little qualifying statement, or almost nobody, is the reality. If you don't think about it for too long, then you can think, yes, we are working together, we are together focused on this common goal. And believing the first part of the statement is what the animals want to do. But look what Orwell's trying to do, what his intent is as an author, his authorial intent. It's to make you, the reader, aware that initial perceptions aren't always telling the full story. Remember when we had chapter 1, we had the sort of the tone of a fable, that initial perception that this was a story about animals, a simplistic story about animals, that we could perhaps relate back to, Aesop's fables or fairy tale creatures. And what we have then is the erosion of that fable, the erosion of that simplistic perception of what this novel's about. And here you have a simple idea, everybody's working together, nobody shirked, but that's eroded by the qualifying statement, almost no one. So once you look hard, once you scrutinise, you'll see the faults. But of course the animals don't want to look hard, they don't want to scrutinise. They're happy to believe the first part of the statement. Snowball realises the importance of ritual and symbolic meaning. Remember, he's the one behind the ideology, he's the one behind the complete system of thought. And what he realises is that to control animals, you need to make them feel that they're all in it together, that there is some sort of common identity that they can all rally around and feel pride in. And so that's what he does with animalism. They hoist the flag, they have the General Assembly. It creates this idea of a shared identity which reaffirms the ideology of animalism. It reaffirms an ideology that the other animals don't understand. But hey, let's not worry about that. Just because they don't understand it doesn't mean that we can't get them to believe in it. That's quite a cynical attitude, but that's the attitude that the pigs have. The flag has symbolic meaning there. It is allegorically meant to represent the flag of that came out after the Russian Revolution, that idea of the Soviet flag, and you've got the green fields and the horn and the hoof, all of it meant to represent this cultural identity of the animals on the farm, and they can see themselves as the natural enemy of humanity, and therefore they can rally around this flag. It feeds their identity, it feeds their soul, it gives them this patriotic sense of who they are. Okay, now remember that language is used as a weapon, that it's used to control, it's used to harm, and Snowball and Squealer both do this. All of the pigs do it, but Snowball does it too. And the way that he does it, the way that Snowball does that is quite callous, because what he does is he understands his audience to some extent. He understands that they're simple, and he understands that they are and sometimes mentally challenged, that they don't have an adequate understanding of the meaning of words. And so he exploits that. He exploits it. How does he do that? Well, okay. So he wants to promote his own beliefs, and that idea of, four legs good, two legs bad. Right, now think about it. When the animals go, oh, well, what about birds? They've got two legs. He needs to make that work. He needs to make the four legs good, two legs bad work for birds. So what he decides to do is he convinces the animals. He says, birds' wings are an organ of propulsion and not manipulation. Now, for animals who can't get beyond the letter A, do you think they're going to understand the word propulsion? No. Do you think they're going to understand the word manipulation? No, not at all. Does Snowball know that? Yes, of course he does. That's what he's counting on. But does it sound really believable? Does it sound as if Snowball knows what he's talking about? Yes, it does. So therefore the animals just absorb it. Remember that verb choice, absorbed. They just absorb it. They don't know what it means, but it sounds good and Snowball says it, so therefore, they can accept it. And that's how he uses language as a weapon, because he uses it to control the other animals who he knows don't understand what he's talking about, but he doesn't care as long as they're devoted to the same cause that he's trying to, that he's trying to shape. Then he doesn't care. So language is Snowball's choice of weapon because it confuses or confounds rather than clarifies. Now, when you think about how those poor animals must be feeling, this is a really good wee quotation. It said, the animals had assumed as a matter of course that these would have been shared out equally, and these refers to the Winfold apples. And look, they had assumed as a matter of course. They believed that they were living in a society of equals, a society where people worked or animals worked together collectively. That's what they believed in. But they're wrong to believe that, because what happens to the Winfold apples? They're shared out amongst the pigs. Now, you know that Snowball and Napoleon were never in agreement. We find that out later on. But the one time they agree, the one time they are, there's your wee quotation, in full agreement, is when it comes to what happens to the windfall animals. No, the windfall apples, not animals at all. The windfall apples. So the one thing that allows Snowball and Napoleon to agree is self-interest and hypocrisy, because they disappoint, they betray the animals who assumed as a matter of course that they were working together in this little collective society. And of course that's not true. And the pigs show with this one act, with the windfall apples, the true self-interest and hypocrisy that lies behind their leadership. Okay, now when you're thinking about the other animals, you have to remember how they are manipulated. And the one way that you can think about their manipulation is through the idea of Squealer as the propagandist. And now we've talked about this in the Squealer PowerPoint, so there's not that much to say, but he's using all these techniques, cleverly using all these techniques to manipulate the animals, to get them to think in the way that he wants them to think. And of course, the verb choice absorbed makes it easy. They're like sponges. So these rhetorical techniques that are used by anyone who wants to be persuasive, many of them have been used by Old Major in chapter 1. They're used by Squealer, but what makes them increasingly effective is how much the other animals want to believe in what he's saying, how easily they absorb, how unquestioning they are, that they absorb everything like sponges. Okay, when you think about the value placed on the other animals, we go to the Battle of the Cowshed here, where the animals play their part. Everyone plays their part, apart from Napoleon and Squealer, who are not mentioned in the chapter whatsoever. They're conspicuous in their absence. But what happens? Well, we know that a sheep dies. It sacrifices its life for animalism. And what does it get for that sacrifice? It gets a medal. It gets the idea of animal hero second class. not first. Now, the key thing there is this is a society of equals, and yet you have that hierarchy of courage and valour brought in with the animal hero, first class and second class. And the idea that the sheep that dies is not valued as much as Snowball and Boxer, who live, wounded but live. So you have that idea that for the other animals, by conferring the honour of second class on the sheep, perhaps it suggests that the other animals are, to the pigs, merely cannon fodder. And that means they're merely bodies placed in front of the enemy. If they get mown down, they get mowed down. It doesn't really matter, because those who are more important and more vital to the cause are behind, and they've got a better chance of attacking the enemy if they're behind the lines of the cannon fodder, the lesser soldiers in the front. So the fact that the second class medal is conferred to the dead sheep perhaps shows us how they are valued, not valued as highly as the others, Snowball and Boxer. But of course you know that anyway, because as I said at the start of part one of this, the other animals are not given an individual identity. There are sheep and there are porkers. They're not called Clover, they're not called Boxer. The lack of identity perhaps suggests that they're not valued in the same way. Okay, now in the campaign that we have in chapter 5, we have Vote for Napoleon and the Full Manger. Of course, Snowball is campaigning under the slogan of Vote for Snowball and the 3-day week. But this goes back to the first action that happened after the initially getting rid of Mr. Jones. How Napoleon realises that what he needs to do is appeal to the basic interests and needs of the populace. He understands that the animals are hungry, that they always will want food, and so he bases his leadership on fundamentals. The idea that the animals will always want their bellies full, they'll always have that self-interest at heart, and therefore his leadership base is based around that. So when the animals think about leadership, they'll think about, okay, who is it that feeds us? It's Napoleon, and therefore he consolidates his leadership. Okay, but what you also have in that chapter 5 is you have the, I suppose, the manifestation of what Napoleon has been doing over the last few chapters, because he has secretly, strategically reared his own private army with the pups that he's taken from Pincher and Jessie. And when he makes that high-pitched whistle, which causes Snowball to run off, the animals, when they see this, they are too amazed and frightened to speak. They're silent and terrified. Now, remember what we said in relation to Orwell, his style and descriptive language or emotive language. It's only used at momentous moments. And here we've got that momentous moment that the animals are silent and terrified. And what we have is that idea that they are completely and utterly stunned by the actions of Napoleon. They've been betrayed in a way that they never believed they would be. And also with that emotive diction, I think it's important that we look at the words used. They're silent and terrified. Now, even when Mr. Jones in chapter 1 fired his gun, okay, even when he fired his gun at the end of chapter 1, the animals all ran back to their houses, and they were asleep in a moment. So gunfire didn't leave them silent and terrified. But this action of Napoleon does leave them silent and terrified. And perhaps what that does is it shows how deeply affected they are by it, how completely out of the blue it is, because they never suspected it. They never suspected it for a second that Napoleon would do something like this. Their lack of comprehension of what has happened emphasises the distance between the ideals that they believed in and the reality of what's happening. So the fact that they're silent and terrified, something that they never were even with gunfire, shows how distant this reality is from the world that they thought they were living in. Okay, now that idea of Napoleon and his dogs, his private army, it's developed in the chapter with these little phrases here. The menacing growls of the dogs and the tremendous bleating of the sheep. And what you have here is this idea that Napoleon has created a combination of violence and ignorance to safeguard or protect his position, because any questioning will be drowned out by either of these two forces, either by the ignorance of the sheep and their bleeding and their bleating, or by the fear of terror that comes with the menacing growls of the dogs. It says indeed that the four porkers were frightened into silence. None of the animals are capable of actually causing any sort of dissent here, or questioning Napoleon, because he's got everything covered. He's got the ignorance of the sheep to cover him one way, and he's got the terror that the dogs instill to cover him a second way. And I think this is important here. In this way, the animals are part of a system that gags them, and that makes it easier for the pigs to manipulate them. They're powerless in this system, and it really shows that what they have done by their ignorance, by their apathy, by their unquestioning acceptance, by their stupidity, they have helped create this dystopian state, the opposite of a utopian where everything's going wrong. They have helped create it, but they didn't even know that's what they were doing. They collaborate unknowingly in their own downfall by placing every part of their alliance on the leadership of the pigs. What they have done is they've walked into this trap. And then we see that idea of the control. Look here, the animals assembled in the big barn to receive their orders, okay? To receive their orders. Where's the equality in that? Well, obviously there isn't equality. And what we have here is we have a clear sense of the hierarchy. It's apparent now. It's there. That equality, all animals are equal. Where's that gone? It's disappeared. It's been drowned out with the tremendous bleeding of the sheep and the menacing growls of the dogs. But not only are they living in a reality that seems hard for them to understand, but that's not enough for Napoleon. Creating a present that's hard to understand isn't enough for Napoleon. What he wants to do is rewrite the past, and that's what he does with the idea of the windmill. It says here that Napoleon obliterates or destroys fundamental concepts like fact, truth, and the past. He changes the past because he says the windmill was his idea. Well, you know that he urinated over it. You as the reader know that. But it shows you just how deeply rooted his power can be, that he can go back in time and change the past. He can make that word truth mean something completely different. He can take the validity out of the word fact, and he can make facts mean something completely different. Total control. Remember the Lord Acton phrase, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely? Well, here you have that absolute power. And there we leave it for part 2, with the animals. They've sleepwalked into their own nightmare, and they are now controlled, past, present and future, by the egotist Napoleon.